morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's paper in the TeTra seminar. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Benedetta Contin. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the ERC project on medieval monastic revival led by Adrian Pirtea at the Institute of Medieval Research of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. In that context, she investigates, amongst other matters, medieval Armenian hagiography with its links to the Greek and Syriac traditions. With 2 PhDs from Venice and Geneva, Benedetta has had a versatile career, having worked in several projects and having taught Armenian history, language, and literature at various universities in Vienna, Venice, Padova, and Lyon. Since 2008, she's also a teacher in the Padus Araxes Summer School of Western Armenian in Venice, which I really recommend, by the way. Benedetta has published widely on Armenian history, philosophy, literature, and theology, from late antiquity until the early modern period. Listing all of her publications is going to take us too far, and so I will just mention that she has published 2 books on David the Philosopher and Armenian philosophy, and also credited a Festschrift for Father Levon Zekian in 2022. Today, she's going to enlighten us about the challenges that she's encountered working with Armenian Post-Chalcedonian theological texts, a topic that she is very familiar with. Benedetta, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for your kind introduction. Thank you. I thank all the conveners for this opportunity to share my research. I hope. Okay, yes, yeah, it works. Yeah, can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, great.
Just put it in full screen. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, sorry for bothering you with such a difficult topic on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. So I tried to keep it short because I know it's a very complicated issue to deal with. And of course, if there is something which is not enough clear, please feel free to address the questions. So as much as I am able to answer, of course. So the problem of defining what the individual is against the universal has been one of the most puzzling and challenging questions that philosophers from different periods have dealt with. While ancient philosophy was randomly concerned with the individual qua individual, a more substantial engagement with defining the primary substance per se is represented by Porphyry, who posed a further distinction between individual and particular. Simultaneously, Christian authors started to use classical philosophy in their reflection to make sense of Trinitarian theology, and terms like nature and hypostasis were introduced as variants of the philosophically informed concepts of ousia and atomon. The first peak in the engagement of Christianity with classical philosophy was in the 4th century with the Cappadocians, who established the first theological definition of individuality by applying Porphyry's theory of individuation to Trinitarian theology. The second peak was instead in the 6th century, when Eastern Christians began to exploit Aristotle and his Neoplatonic commentators, especially in the field of logic, to make sense of controversial Christological stances. Sorry. On the Armenian side, the chronological time frame between the end of the 7th and the 8th centuries marked a turning point not only in Armenian theology, but also in Armenian history of philosophy in its broader sense. And by broader sense, I intend Armenian intellectual history, so not only philosophy in a strict sense. Challenged by the Christological debates that blew up in the aftermath of Chalcedon, the Armenians elaborated their own reflection on nature, hypostasis, and idioms to confute the Byzantine Chalcedonian allegations of unorthodoxy. There are several factors that contributed to shape an indigenous Armenian patristic philosophy. I argue that there are 4 crucial factors in this process, and namely, the first is the reception of a Cappadocian ontology. The second is again the reception of a post-Chalcedonian ontology, and especially that of Leontius of Byzantium and John of Damascus. The third is the domestication and the foreignization of Greek logic, and eventually the fourth, a specific Armenian Christianization of classical philosophy, which was already available in Armenian language. To illustrate the process by which the Armenian church elite appropriated the Greek knowledge system, let us take a while to read the following 2 historical witnesses. The first, so I read very brief. So Stepanos Orbelian tells us, historian, thus ambassadors and heralds of the Greeks never cease their comings and goings, and many times they ordered the gatherings by inviting Armenians once to Constantinople and thrice to Theodosiopolis. And on these occasions there were severe face-to-face inquiries. At that time, in Armenia, there was a renewal in education, and new centers were built, in which there were experienced and skilled persons in Greek language and educational system. So this first witness refers to the beginning of the 7th century and shows that the knowledge of Greek language and philosophy was instrumental in endowing the Armenians with an indigenous rhetorical and logical arsenal to dismiss allegations of unorthodoxy in public controversies and, of course, political conflicts. The second vignette, I leave you to read it by yourselves. So the second vignette illustrates the practical effects of such an endeavor a century later, and namely in the 8th century. So we are at the beginning, first half of the, or first quarter of the 8th century. Here, Hovhannes Draskanakertsi tells us that Catholicos Hovhannes Otsnetsi, the convener of the Armeno-Syriac Council of Manaskert in 226, had a full mastery of every aspect of Aristotelian logic. Between the 6th and the 8th centuries, there was a proliferation of works in patristic philosophy, in which the massive penetration and use of technical terms coming from Aristotle, Porphyry, and the Stoic philosophy is very clear. In what follows, you have an overview of written texts produced by non-Chalcedonian Armenians on the one hand, and here by Chalcedonian or pro-Chalcedonian Armenians on the other hand. The second group, so this group of texts, contains works either composed in Armenian or translated from Greek. whereas to the first group belong only texts originally composed in Armenian. Among the texts that I list for today's lecture, I chose to focus on some excerpts from one text that makes a convincing case for showing the pervasive use of Aristotelian logical tools and devices in a theological framework. And so the text, so at the beginning I chose to deal with the two texts, but then I realized that it's really too much. And so I decided, so for this reason you see in bold characters two texts, but actually so I decided to focus on the first text, so on the Book of Beings. Also because about the second text I took so for another lecture in Venice, so I don't want to repeat myself. I don't like it. No, sorry, I stay here for the moment. So the text in question is the Book of Beings, in Armenian Girk e Akats, a philosophical theological compilation in question-answer form, which is generally ascribed to David the Invincible in the Armenian manuscript tradition. In the course of transmission, the book was associated with another pseudepigraphic treatise known as the second one, questions addressed to the heretical Diophysites by the Holy Armenian Church doctors Moses and David. Both texts have been recently, just 10 years ago, edited by Guar Muradian in the volume 20 of the series Matena Girka Yots. The question of both texts' authorship is not relevant here. What is relevant instead is that the Book of Beings and the questions stemmed from a school, or maybe more than one, in which the Corpus Aristotelicum and the logical works of David the Invincible were read, commented, and used as reference sources. I showed elsewhere that the Book of Beings was most likely redacted in the late 7th century and originated in a non-Chalcedonian milieu. The book shows a significant knowledge and familiarity with Aristotle's categories and metaphysics, as well as with Porphyry's theory of individuality and its Cappadocian adaptation to Trinitarian theology. The book brings forth theoretical novelties in matching Aristotle's matter-form theory with the doctrine of persona, as spelled out by late antique Greek-speaking Miaphysite theologians and philosophers. Its fortune is attested in a quite important manuscript circulation. Manuscripts containing the questions include most of, but not the whole book. So we have the book and the questions circulating simultaneously in the same manuscripts, but not the questions. If we have the questions, we can have the whole book or part of it included in the questions. On the one hand, excerpts of the book independently circulated in manuscripts under the general title of questions or disputes. So it's also difficult to identify the text. This shows that significant passages were sometimes excerpted from the book according to the choice of the scribe, and that these passages could be read without necessarily referring to the questions. On the other hand, relevant excerpts of the questions, and particularly the first part with its chronographic account of the meeting between Emperor Theodosius II and David and Moses, were absorbed into and circulated as the Book of Beings. So we have a kind of metatextual transmission of both the texts. That several and various compilations of the same text circulated in different manuscripts is also witnessed by other sources. In the first edition of the Handbook of Logic by 17th century Simeon Giurayetsi, published in Constantinople in 1728, the book is included in a version which differs considerably from the one that we read in Muradian's edition. And now let us deal with hardcore concepts. So at the beginning of the Book of Beings, we have a compelling back and forth between David the Invincible and his antagonist, who is a fictional character representing the Constantinopolitan Chalcedonian ecclesiastical establishment. In the excerpts reported in the slides, the author of the book marks off the notion of a former recipient person from that of a formless person, but unfortunately doesn't not develop his argument further. Even though it is very difficult to reconstruct the theoretical underpinnings of the book in absence of systematic discussions, because we should remember that it's a question-answer treatise and not a systematic philosophical work or commentary. Nevertheless, I tried to figure out possible and sounding interpretations of the philosophical concepts exposed in the text. Of course, in this case, hermeneutics is a highly dangerous job. In my view, the first distinction between a formless and a former recipient person suggests two complementary readings of these notions. In the first case, I argue that the term former recipient person refers to the most specific category of species, that is, the individual, while a formless person merely denotes one member of any species. In this case, we are speaking of the species man, which is identified by the essential properties or qualities that he, she, it shares with other members of the same species, but is not marked off by any hypostatic adium. Should this be the right interpretation, formless person may refer to the total amount of all the hypostases that belong to a species. A second way of making sense of the notions used in this passage we are dealing with relies on Aristotle's matter-form theory, otherwise known as hylomorphism, as it is exposed in his Physics and Metaphysics. In this vein, the idea of a former recipient person denotes the form-matter compound, which becomes a concrete specific instantiation of the common nature by means of distinctive properties. By contrast, formless person shows the very substratum of the object. That means the materiality of the object, in our case, of the object man. The term formless person intends to describe, in this sense, the material constituents of man, that is, flesh and bones, in which the form inheres. In this respect, formless person is therefore a not yet qualified individual, lacking its TODT marker, that is, its essential form and its accidents. Yet, form is not the sine qua non for qualifying a person, as we read in the back and forth exposed in this slide. Yes, here you have, so does a person co-removed by nature, or is a person co-removed by a nature? A person is co-removed by the, and then you have also the question of so the final question of does a person give subsistence to a form, or does it gain subsistence from a form? So it's clear here that form is not so is not the so mode of being for the person that characterize the person as such. So the last text from the book is this that I choose from the book is this passage in which we have two very so telling back and forth between David and his so counterpart. I read them because it's very important to be focused on them. So the first question is, what is a person and what a nature? Reply. A nature replies from David. So a nature reveals the common, whereas a person the characteristic idioms. What is a person and what is an image? An image is the image of a this such, while a person is a this such. So, the term person is referred to as a this such, and the bearer of characteristic idioms, the latter marked by the unusual Armenian word arantsnakan, here arantsnakank. What kind of person is the author of the Book of Beings speaking of? What is the relation between a this such and the former recipient person? These are not trivial questions, considering that the concept of personhood plays a crucial role in apologetic and dogmatical Christian literature, and in particular the Armenian one. The choice of the term arantsnakan indicates that the object is not unqualified. Arantsnakan shares indeed the same root of arantsnavorution, that in turn corresponds to the Greek idiotetes, and may be interpreted as a theological doublet of Porphyry's concept of proper or particular feature. It should be noted that in David Invincible's Armenian version of the commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge, the term particular feature, propers, is rendered by atkution, so another word, not the same arantsnavorution or arantsnakan. So, by relying on Gregory of Nyssa and David's commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge, the Book of Beings brings forth an unprecedented novelty by introducing the concept of arantsnakan. This term indicates indeed the accidental particular, that means the particular instantiation of universals in non-substance categories. So, no substance categories as, for instance, quality. Arantsnakan shows, therefore, a set of particular exemplifications that is unique to the individual substance in which this set inheres, and cannot be seen in any other individual. For instance, boldness, which is a quality, so a no substance category, is seen in an X individual, in this case a this such, as a particular instantiation of a specific severity of boldness. So there are some men which are more so bolder than others, and there are so different degrees of boldness. In this sense, it is worth noting that the Book of Beings strives to distinguish between proper features and their instantiation in a specific X individual, which is the person. To sum up and conclude, the Book of Beings introduces three novel notions. Formless person, in Armenia ankerp dem, form recipient person, kerpavor dem, and edis such, voken. Highly significant for further Christological speculations is the latter. This such is a person with characteristic idioms with so arantsnakank. That means when this means when accidental properties or non-essential accidents inherit the matter-form compound, we have a this such or a person in its full sense. So if we put it in Aristotelian terms, we can say that we have so a person in its so as an intellekia, so in its full sense. I argue that the concept of a formless person shows a mode of being of ousia in its lower ontological condition, which is very close to the concept of enhypostaton, as we find it in Leontius of Byzantium. But I want to say that so I realized this thing when I was preparing the paper. So it's really an hypothesis. So I share it with you because I found it so exciting when I realized these things, but of course I have to think about it and to substantiate it. So at this stage, that is what is important for me and what I hope I provide with this so short talk is to outline that at this stage, between the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th century, we can appreciate the impressive theoretical advancements in logical reasoning in the non-Chalcedonian or Miaphysite Armenian intellectual milieus. In fact, post-Chalcedonian Christological controversies, that is, how to keep the singular properties of two different hypostases in one nature, prompted the Armenians to elaborate their own patristic ontology by relying on a well-established practice of using Aristotelian logic in a theological context. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Benedetta, for delving with us into this very challenging topic and for presenting the Book of Beings in such an intricate way. It's my pleasure now to open the floor for questions. Please, if you would like to ask a question to Benedetta or to raise a point of discussion, feel free to raise your virtual hand. And it's also possible to write questions in the chat if you prefer. And perhaps to start us off, if I may, Benedetta, could I just out of curiosity ask about your final slide, the one you showed us with the diagram? I was just curious if in your work on these texts and traditions, do you encounter diagrams or other ways of visually representing the relationships? Do you encounter that a lot, or is it usually just written text?
So in most cases, it's written text, but there are some diagrams, and it's this one, for instance, is not related to the Book of Beings, but you see it's on the properties of God, and I didn't study. So I put, when you collect the manuscripts and images, and then you think, okay, one day I will do the work, but that day didn't come till today. So, but I find very interesting that we have this diagram, so Arbor Porphyry.
Yes.
And so with categories which don't belong to the classical Arbor Porphyry. So we have other terms in the arbor. So I think of course it's another study to be done. So the use of diagrams in this kinds of text.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. For the next two questions, I will first move to Dan, and then I think Albert also has a question. So first Dan, and then afterwards Albert, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A very, very interesting talk, even for the outsiders. And I have the ignorance question, which is, you could just continue something you said. On the matter of vocabulary. So the examples that you showed us, I didn't see many Greek words used. I've seen translations for the most part from the Greek philosophical vocabulary. How does it go there in Armenian? Are the Greek words used? Are they always translated? And then you showed us already that the Armenian introduces new terms and so on. How does the Armenian philosophical vocabulary go about adopting Greek, transforming Greek, and inventing new terms? I'm just curious.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So if we speak about strictly philosophical texts, generally we have this corpus Davidicum, in which we have the classical comment, so the definitions and divisions of philosophy. And then three commentaries on Aristotle and Porphyry. In these texts, the vocabulary, so the trans-rendering from Greek into Armenian is quite predictable. So it's quite very close. You can reconstruct the underlying Greek word. Of course, for instance, I make one of my most favorite examples is that of epinoia, which is translated into makamotatsutyun. So you have the mak, which is epi, and then noia, which is noesis, which is matatsutyun, so from mitk, so you have the word nous, and then the adaptation, the abstract form of the noun. So it's quite very regular practice of translating. In our text, so in the Book of Beings, I don't think it's a translation from a Greek text. I don't think. And in any case, if it is a translation from a Greek text, we should suppose non-Chalcedonian Greeks or non-Chalcedonian Armenians writing in Greek. So I think it's too much complicated to think about it. So it's easier to argue that it's an Armenian, originally composed Armenian text, and also the vocabulary is not so Chalcedonian friendly vocabulary. I mean, it's the perspective is totally different, because you don't have much, there is not much about nature and hypostasis, so the focus is on a person, so on a prosopon. So they took the question, this post-Chalcedonian, so big main question of so how to match two natures, two hypostases with one nature. They took the question from so a kind of bottom-up approach. So from the primary substance, from the prosopon, towards the secondary substance, so towards the highest ontological level, ousia nature. And I have the impression that on the Greek side it's the opposite. So they start from, they have a top-down approach, so it's on the other. But at the end, they speak the same language. So this is a very, very interesting, I find. I don't know if I replied to your question. Was it clear?
It did.
Yeah.
It was very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Albert.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question about is Armenian Book of Chalcedon close to our Western individuality? And how is that? Is there any biblical base for it, like Genesis 1:26, the man as icon of God or something? Is there some relation or not?
Yeah, so in the Book of Beings there is also a section so devoted to the the man as image, so as an icon, patker in Armenian of God. So you have also this discussion on the and also the use of the word patker is very interesting because of course it's not only not the only sign or passage which tells us about the chronological time of composition, because of the analogy with the image of man as image of God is very familiar and used and so on. There are of course other considerations that pushed me to locate this text at the end of the 7th century. But it would be interesting to compare with Vartanès' treatise on the images, on the cult of the images, and also with Ovannes Otsnetsis' treatise on the Paulicians, in which he deals with iconoclasm and such questions. And as for the Western philosophy, I have the impression that the Armenians are closer to 12th, 13th century Western philosophy, and namely the concept of echeitas. But of course, it's a thing to be a topic to be studied further, because it's only an hypothesis, working hypothesis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and all the best.
Let me now move briefly to the chat, where there also is a question on vocabulary.
Yeah.
Benedetta is asking if the Armenians read several of Alexandria's writings on the nature of Christ and copied it, or if they developed their own theological vocabulary. Related perhaps to what Dan has been asking.
Yeah. So Cyril was very important for the Armenians, and is quoted. So is one of the most quoted church fathers. Yeah, of course, there was so the idea of so the miaphysicism. Sorry for this, I don't like this term at all. But Cyril's miaphysicism was for sure one of the one of the most. He was one of the most important authorities for the Armenians concerning as for this point. But I am not an expert of Cyril, so don't ask me further.
Thank you. We certainly do have a bit more time for questions, if anybody has something to discuss. Andy, please.
Maybe just out of interest about the reception of this text in the later period. Can you say something about how many manuscripts and what kind of context? I'm guessing a monastic context, but are they being used? Can you tell from the manuscripts? I don't know if you've even looked at that. Are there sort of notes in the margins that clearly this text is still being used in a way in education in the monastic context, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so manuscripts, I worked on on 3 manuscripts, one from Vienna, one from Matenadaran, and the other from Venice. So the Guar Muradian's edition is also based on, I think, more than 20 manuscripts. But of course from Matenadaran, so kept in Matenadaran. Yeah, it's not such a big, huge amount of manuscripts, but it's quite a lot. I suppose there are other manuscripts containing the book. I didn't work on this, on the transmission, manuscript transmission, so it can be that there are for sure other manuscripts. What is interesting, I mentioned it, is the fact that the book was included in this Handbook of Logic, published in Constantinople in 1728. And of course, it was not only for monks and churchmen, but it was also for the larger public, because when they decided to print something in Constantinople, it was because there was a good audience, so a substantial audience, which was not only the one of the monasteries and the monastic schools. So I guess it had, and maybe in Constantinople at that time, yeah, this one is also an interesting point, because there were a lot of discussions between the Catholics, so the Latin Catholic Church and the Armenian Apostolic Church, and of course also so very violent discussions. So it's not casual.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
There also is a valid question by Dan.
I also have a question on reception, or not, or on reception, or what comes after. So you're focusing on the seventh, at the end of late antiquity. So on this, on the end of late antiquity, and I was wondering whether this type of literature and this type of problems had a really good century in those 2 centuries, or it continued immediately after? What happens after the end of late antiquity with that, with all of this, if you have looked at it at all?
I didn't study this issue, but of course I want to do it in the future. For instance, I studied it, but in the immediate period, so successive period, which is the period of Ovannes Otsenetsi. So we are in the first quarter of the 8th century. And in Hosrovik, the translator or the rhetor, who was one of the main supporters of Ovannes Otsenetsi. And there is a clear influence of the Book of Beings on these 2 authors. But of course, we are close in time. I guess there was a circulation of the book also in the Cilician time, because you have this so again a period of quarrels between the Byzantines and the Armenians, and I guess it was used some way for this purpose. But of course, it should be studied. I don't have now a clear answer to this.
Oh, no, thank you very much. That makes sense to me.
If there are no further questions, I propose that we thank our speaker, Benedetta, for her paper, but also for being the guiding teacher in our own modern session of questions and responses. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you
very much. Very good seeing everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Goodbye.
Yeah, you
Have a
too.
good
Take
Bye.
care.
Here,
Bye.
Jolly good weekend.
here it is St. Nicholas Day.
Yes, it's
Ah,
lovely.
yeah.
Oh,
Go and enjoy that.